This week on Government Matters.
If that happens, it'll be great for consumers, great for the wireless industry. Now, if it's a flop, it's really going to be a problem for the FCC.
We've been talking about it for years. This week, the Federal Communications Commission opened their broadcast incentive auction.
The browser is the primary interface to all of those web services, whether it's work-related or personal-related. But 25 years ago, when this technology was invented, security wasn't even thought of.
A veteran of Silicon Valley startups wants to redefine the word silo in government. He thinks the new paradigm for browser security is housed in the cloud.
It's really good to know what is either holding back agencies in terms of the technology they're using.
MuckRock.com needs your help tracking down the government's oldest computer. Government Matters starts right now.
From ABC 7 and News Channel 8, this is Government Matters.
To our viewers around the world on the American Forces Network and here in the nation's capital, thanks for joining us. Government is the engine that runs this city. That's why Government Matters. Every week we'll bring you the top headlines in tech, security, and management. I'm your host, Morris Jones. This week, the FBI dropped its legal fight to compel Apple to open their iPhone. The surprise development was a win and a loss for Apple, along with privacy advocates. The court order is no more. But now, Apple has no obvious legal avenue to learn how the FBI did it. That makes everyone's iPhone less secure. Could this give rise to a new breed of smartphone? We sent Diane Cho to find out.
While the legal battle between the FBI and tech giant Apple may be over for now, the debate is far from it. This after a third party helped the federal agency crack into an encrypted iPhone used by San Bernardino shooter Saeed Farouk.
The fact that it was the government who may have found a weakness that they are now exploiting just gives Apple added incentive to make sure that their phones are secure.
The FBI has yet to reveal exactly how that weakness was exploited or publicly state which company was even involved.
There are ways to get around Apple's security, and so it opens up the floodgates for, once it's proven possible, well, it opens up the floodgates for any hacker to come in there and try to replicate that.
That's just the outcome Apple CEO Tim Cook was worried about. He says his company complies with subpoenas and search warrants, but that the FBI's request would have created a backdoor to bypass security features on Apple's flagship product. The case and its surprise solution could give rise to even more advanced levels of encryption on basic calls and text messages. Enter the so-called unhackable smartphone.
So if you're concerned about your communications being eavesdropped on or third parties getting your communications, then it doesn't get any more secure than that.
Steven Stokels is the CEO of Freedom Pop, the company who created a privacy phone dubbed the Snowden phone after NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden.
If you're going to certain sites or using certain applications, that would be masked. It's impossible for a third-party agency.
He says that means it would also prevent the company from accessing the device. According to Freedom Pop data, there is a niche market for privacy phones in the U.S., but most consumers don't make buying decisions based on security.
The megapixels on the camera would be top of the list. Security would be close to the bottom of the list.
But would that have happened on the Snowden phone, or would it keep hackers and government agencies alike in the dark?
On one level, they probably would have more easily been able to gain access to the physical device and see photos on it, etc. But on another level, they would not have been able to see any of the communications that went on.
For Government Matters, I'm Diane Cho.
Let's take a look now at some agency headlines. Fierce Government IT reports President Obama has extended an executive order. It allows the government to block the property of anyone deemed a threat to national cybersecurity. The move comes 1 week after Justice Department officials charged 7 hackers tied to the Iran government. FedScoop reports the Office of Management and Budget wants to save $230 million by simplifying the way agencies buy mobile services. It's part of a government-wide effort to improve IT acquisition through category management. Uncle Sam spends $1 billion on mobile devices and services each year. Military Times reports Peter Levine will take over as acting Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness. He'll replace Brad Carson on April 8th. Before joining DOD, Levine spent nearly 2 decades at the Senate Armed Services Committee. In Tech Matters, a busy week for the Federal Communications Commission. We start with the broadcast incentive auction. On Tuesday, the FCC opened a first-of-its-kind auction designed to encourage licensees to voluntarily relinquish spectrum usage rights in exchange for a share of the proceeds. It could net tens of billions of dollars. Joining me with the latest is Lydia Beyoud, telecom reporter for Bloomberg BNA. Lydia, let's talk about the timeline here. In late April, we'll get a better picture of how much spectrum is at stake. In May, this auction will really ramp up. Tell us more.
That's right. This is the first time the FCC or any agency has tried a two-sided auction of this sort. So although the official kickoff date was March 29th, not much is going to be happening right now, but as you said, things will accelerate in late spring, and that's when broadcasters will actually start taking bids that will go down, actually, to sell their spectrum back to the FCC. The FCC will, a little bit later after that part of the auction closes, turn around and sell it back to wireless providers. And it's not just the big four, it's a lot of regional wireless providers, as well as some groups like Dish Network, which is the satellite company, and even Comcast Corporation are also in the bidding wars.
I'll have more on the sell back in just a second. And this is an entirely novel endeavor for the FCC. There's a lot on the line. What happens if it works out, and what happens if it flops?
So this auction is the creation of Congress back in 2012, and there's a little bit at stake for them as well. The hope is that the auction will be a success and relinquish over 100 megahertz of spectrum to the wireless industry. If that happens, it'll be great for consumers, great for the wireless industry. Now, if it's a flop, it's really going to be a problem for the FCC. Congress has oversight of the agency, and you can bet that if there's any sort of failure or pressure point, Congress will have them in for hearings.
All right, all makes sense. Spectrum is a finite resource. The Defense Department owns a lot of it, and for good reason. How could this auction impact them down the road?
This auction is going to be a proof of concept for what could happen with federal spectrum. If it works out, and the FCC is certainly confident that it will, agencies like the Department of Defense, which holds a lot of spectrum nationwide, and other agencies like Department of Interior could be incentivized somehow, probably through the sharing of auction proceeds, to give up a portion of their spectrum as well and maybe move to other bands and share with other agencies or even with private users. So if this works out, it could prove a model for the federal government to follow and maybe even internationally.
Now, Lydia, on Thursday, the FCC started the rulemaking process that will decide whether or not internet service providers can share consumer data with third parties. Explain that.
So this is a proposed rule from the FCC, and what they want to do is give consumers more choice over how their internet service provider shares and sells the data that they collect on their customers. The idea is that they would give consumers control to consent by opting in to having that data shared with a third party that would then build a profile about you and send you targeted advertisements. ISPs really want to keep control of that, and if it becomes an opt-in, which is a higher hurdle than the current opt-out, which requires the consumer to be aware and go in and change their settings, they're worried that they could lose quite a bit of revenue.
Mm-hmm. Now, there is an entire ecosystem hoping to purchase consumer data. How will this rulemaking process affect them?
That's right. There are data brokers, there are app developers and marketers who all buy this information from ISPs, and they could have less insight into what consumers want and how to specifically target their products directly to you and me. So they could also really be impacted by this, and it would also push them to buying even more data than they already do from folks like Facebook and Google. And ISPs say that that puts them at a disadvantage with those internet companies.
One more thing I want to ask you about. Let's talk about the elephant in the room, namely net neutrality. What's the latest?
So there's a federal court that's expected to rule any day, really, on the outcome of those rules, and it could have quite an impact on the FCC and the wireless and the cable internet industries. No one really knows what's going to happen. There's been some rumor that they might strike the rules down in part, maybe in whole, or they could uphold them. The idea was that if the rules are upheld by the court, they would seek an appeal to the Supreme Court, but with Justice Scalia's death and a vacancy on the bench, it's no longer quite certain that they would necessarily go that route. But certainly, there's more to come on those fronts, no matter what happens.
Lydia Beyoud, telecom reporter for Bloomberg BNA. Thanks, Lydia.
Thank you.
We'll turn from tech to security straight ahead on Government Matters. In the early 2000s, Scott Petry revolutionized the way Google managed email. Now he wants to change the way federal agencies surf the web. A new paradigm for browser security next. In security matters, a new paradigm for browser security. Let's set the stage for this discussion, courtesy of the write-up from 18F. When you visit a website, your computer connects to the website's computer. This means you send information about yourself sprinting across the internet at the speed of light. When you connect over ordinary HTTP, it's like sending a postcard in the mail where every computer in between you and the website gets to see your information. Well, that includes cookies, the browser you use, and your location. To protect consumers, government is in the middle of a push to make all federal websites Hypertext Transfer Protocol secure, or HTTPS. From the outside looking in, that's a great thing. But what about the other way around? For more, I'm joined by Scott Petry, CEO of Authentic8. Scott, let's start there. Most federal workers have a computer at their desk or a laptop at their disposal. What happens when they access websites outside of their organization? Are there risks associated with doing so?
There are, Morris. It's exactly as you described. That browser opens a connection to a destination web server. That server pulls all the information together, whether it's their own page data or advertising content from third parties, bundles it up as a big blob of code, and delivers it to the browser. The browser then opens it up and displays the page as users expect to see it.
Now, some of our viewers might remember your work with Postini, an email management vendor snapped up by Google in 2007. 2 years ago, you debuted a new product with your new company, Authentic8. It's called Silo. Now you're trying to expand Silo's footprint in government. How does it work?
Well, Silo is very similar to Postini in that we wanted to shift the threat surface area away from the point that was being attacked by the typical criminals. In the email world, it was to move away from the mail server and absorb the threats in the processing layer we built in the cloud. Silo is very similar. Instead of running the browser on the user's end device, we run the browser in a secure environment in the cloud where all the web code executes, and then we just present a secured display of that browser session down to the end user's PC.
Scott, when you launched Silo, it merited a write-up in Forbes. The author called it an interesting idea, but offered this critique, quote, "The problem I have with Silo is that there's a whole lot of utility that users gain from having a degree of persistence in their browsers. Cookies, remembered passwords, and browser extensions all help make internet users' lives more efficient. Sure, Silo might lessen some risk of danger, but it does so at a more general lessening of the browser experience." Now, is that a fair assessment? And furthermore, to government, does browser experience really matter?
Two questions there. The first, I'll say that was a fair assessment a couple of years ago when we launched, but we've been very busy expanding the functionality. Today, those things that editor wrote about, the ability to store bookmarks, the ability to store credentials, the ability to customize the browser experience, that's all built into our product today, and it's what our users are using. And there's plenty of more stuff that's coming. In terms of, do people need to use the internet in work? I think it's absolutely true, whether it's a business function, accessing cloud apps, or even managing that work-life balance, having to get to webmail or Facebook or Team Snap in order to figure out what people need to do once they're off work. The web is a reality today. The browser is the primary interface to all of those web services, whether it's work-related or personal-related. But 25 years ago when this technology was invented, security wasn't even thought of.
You got a good point there. In the wake of last year's massive data breach at the Office of Personnel Management, the Obama administration has taken significant efforts to overhaul its cybersecurity posture. Now they're trying to expand continuous diagnostics and mitigation and get agencies to implement basic controls like two-factor authentication. How should browser security factor in here?
It's funny, Morris, because the browser is the source of a lot of this evil, and yet the tools that IT, whether they're in enterprise or whether they're in government, skirt the issue. They're all around the periphery. It's locking down the network, it's putting in filtering in place, it's analyzing packets. We believe the browser itself is the area where an IT administrator can get the most leverage. Putting the browser in that secure environment and then implementing policy controls, including things like two-factor authentication requirements, makes the browser the point of control. That way you can get securely to your internet resources, regardless of network, regardless of device, regardless of location, without undermining your security controls.
Yeah, I think you're right. Good to have you on board. Scott Petry, CEO of Authentic8. Thanks and good luck, Scott.
Morris, my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
We'll turn from security to management straight ahead on Government Matters. Remember COBOL, or Common Business-Oriented Language? It's computer speak designed by Grace Hopper nearly 60 years ago. Well, a lot of federal computers still use COBOL, and that's just the tip of the legacy IT iceberg. We hunt for the government's oldest, clunkiest computer next. In Management Matters, the hunt for the government's oldest computer. The collaborative news site MuckRock.com needs your help tracking down the government computer most in need of an upgrade. Joining me with the latest is the man behind the project, Allan Lasser, developer for MuckRock. He joins us via Skype from Boston. Well, Allan, before we get into your search, tell us about MuckRock itself. What is it and how does it work?
So MuckRock is a collaborative news site where anyone can sign up to file a FOIA request. And we also publish investigative reporting, mostly based on government documents and requests we filed ourselves.
All right, well, last month you asked readers for help finding the, quote, clunkiest, slowest, punch-cardiest machine still in use by an agency. Why undertake this project? What were you looking for?
So there's a few reasons that this project's really interesting to me. The first is just like the novelty and the interest of it. Vintage computers are interesting and fun to read and learn about. And on a more practical and investigative note, it's really good to know what is either holding back agencies in terms of the technology they're using, or what agencies are really good about maintaining the technology they have and not overspending or upgrading too soon.
They might be embarrassed, though, to admit that they're still using an old Sperry Univac, for example. What have you found so far?
So far, I've mostly found a lot of Dells, computers going back to the early 90s. And that's only because I've only just started filing against some of the tips I've gotten. And I've been hearing about mainframes in different health and human services organizations. I've been hearing a lot of stuff about vacuum tube computers in the Navy, although nothing too specific yet. And I've also been hearing about scientific programs like NASA and the different national laboratories where there might be decades that are spanning, or experiments that span decades, and those computers need to be constantly up because when the experiment started, they were cutting edge.
Yeah, I think you're right about all that. So how can our viewers, Allan, in Washington and around the world on the American Forces Network contribute to your research?
Well, if you have any tips, you can send them to my email address, allan@muckrock.com, ALLAN. Or you can go online to muckrock.com, subscribe to the newsletter, and follow along.
Now, before you go, Allan, give us some perspective here. You graduated from Boston University in 2014 with degrees in computer science and American studies. As a millennial, how do you view the government's reliance on some of these ancient legacy systems? Do you find it funny, scary, frustrating, or all of the above?
Definitely all of the above. There's definitely, I definitely have respect for the departments that can maintain a system that old. I know there were some job postings for Fortran programmers a few years ago, I think at NASA, and that's super interesting, and it's great that we still have people practicing skills that would otherwise be antiquated. But on the other hand, when you have systems that aren't being maintained as well, there's real security vulnerabilities there, and it's important that we know where those are and so we can get rid of them.
Are you at a point where you would advise and suggest to the government what types of cutting-edge technology they use? I mean, I knew DARPA was working on a biological membrane computer years back. Anything current that's out there that you would say, hey, this is what you should give up and this is what you should use?
Well, I think if I had to give a suggestion, I'd say use stable, well-maintained system software, and go for the cheapest possible option if it's available, and also invest in people who can maintain these and try not to shop out your IT. There's plenty of cheap Linux boxes. Linux is a free distribution, and if we're talking about fiscal responsibility, that's a great place to start.
I'll be curious what kind of clunky computer you end up finding in government. Allan Lasser, developer for MuckRock. Thanks and good luck, Allan.
Thank you.
We'll turn from management to final matters straight ahead. About 2 years ago, Facebook spent $2 billion on Oculus, the maker of a virtual reality headset. Some analysts thought CEO Mark Zuckerberg was nuts. Today, VR's cousin, augmented reality, is poised to go mainstream. It's already shaping the public and private sectors for years to come. Mary Maloney explains.
This is our most desperate hour. Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope.
The future, as depicted in Star Wars, may be closer than ever. Microsoft's HoloLens wants to eventually change the way you see and interact with the world. It uses augmented reality, which takes holograms and projects them onto your surroundings, blending the technology with real life. Microsoft showcased its HoloLens product at its annual Build conference. Already, a number of companies are experimenting with HoloLens. Among other things, NASA uses the technology to virtually take people to Mars.
Scientists are now using our Mars tool on-site in mission operations.
Lowe's helps customers pick out products like cabinets and sinks and uses a hologram to place those products into their kitchens. And the School of Medicine at Case Western Reserve University uses it to teach students.
We've had a small team of 3 computer programmers turning our ideas into reality.
Ideas like using the 3D interactive hologram to study the anatomy, or to virtually transport a professor in another location into the classroom.
The 3 of us can see each other as we're talking, which makes us feel connected. And even though you can only see my head and hands, you get a sense of my body language.
As of now, only developers can get hold of the $3,000 product, but Microsoft hopes others can create apps within HoloLens and eventually market it to the general public.
And that's the latest from Washington. Thanks for being with us. I'm Morris Jones. We know your week is filled with other matters. Save this half hour for us.